Well, that was fun. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, or if you are new here, then please do me a favour and hit that subscribe button. The NFL Draft Combine came and went over the past weekend, so I wanted to talk about, what went down over the weekend in Indy in regards to what players stood out, for good or for bad, as well as just give my thoughts on the chatter coming out of the Combine surrounding the Browns. This video might make a bit more sense if you watched my preview, as of course I listed, guys I was personally looking out for over the weekend, so a lot of those guys come up in this video. But if you didn't watch that video, it doesn't matter, it all still applies the same. But I'll try and make this as quick as I can, because I will admit I am a bit of a draft nerd, if you haven't figured it out by yet. I was doing draft stuff a few years before I even did any NFL content. It's the one thing I can get a bit nerdy with, along with the salary cap stuff, so I'll try and make it as quickly as I can, but also, insightful as well. Let's start with the quarterbacks because, well, you know why. Jalen Milroe, my guilty pleasure of a draft pick, had himself a good weekend. First and foremost, his hands grew an inch since the Senior Bowl, so that's good news. All seriousness, we got to probably start seriously questioning how the Senior Bowl, do their measurements, because first Jalen Milroe's hands and then Dylan Gabriel's height, they've gotten something seriously wrong. And, it might sound silly, but this stuff can affect where guys get drafted. They do need to address it. They measured Milroe's hands as under 9 inches, something that's viewed, as a big no-no for draft prospects at quarterback, when in actual fact his hands are actually well over 9 inches and are actually bigger than most other quarterbacks in this draft. So that was, of course, the first positive news for Milroe this weekend, along with the other measurements as well. Then he went out for the throw-in session and, in my opinion, proved why he is a quarterback, not a tight end. That ball was coming out of his hands with better velocity than any other quarterback out there. They weren't always perfectly accurate, but his live arm was on show for all to see, especially on his deep ball throws. I would have liked to see his weight at around 220, but 217 is fine enough. Still a young man with plenty of time to add some weight. And, I would, of course, as well like to see him run, as I believe he would have easily ran a 4.4. He is an athletic freak. Daniel Jeremiah compared his rushing ability to Anthony Richardson. So, it would have been nice to see that ability showcased. But at the end of the day, we all know he's fast, so I understand why he didn't feel the need to run it. The whole he's not a quarterback stuff would have only been amplified if he ran fast but didn't throw well. So it's easy to see why he, opted to focus solely on the throwing session instead. But yeah, I've said it before, I'm intrigued, I really am. I've been called crazy, but I've said during this whole process that Milroe on day 2 would probably be my preference at quarterback, obviously, as well as bringing in a veteran. I mean, if I could press a button that guarantees the Browns could get Milroe in the 3rd round, I'd press it. But I doubt he's there at 67. Hell, he might not even be there at 33 if a team decides to bet on his upside in the 1st round. Jackson Dart probably looked like the most accurate quarterback in the throwing drills. He went 18 for 23 on his throws, and the ball was coming out with, fairly decent zip. He came in at just under 6'3" and just over 220 pounds, so very, very good size. I'll admit it, I've not given Dart as much love, shall we say, as some of the other guys, so maybe I'll have to dive into him a bit more leading up to the draft. He's consistently been around my quarterback 4, but was a good weekend for him at the Combine. The reports on Quinn Ewers were all over the place. Some said he looked good, others said he looked bad. From what I saw from his throwing drills, I wasn't impressed. I would probably avoid Ewers like the plague. I might be wrong, but I personally just don't see it at all. Finally, on the QBs who participated in drills this weekend, Will Howard showed just how subjective these workouts can be. Social media was clowning him, what they were calling the worst combine performance ever. Yet some of the analysis that that were there were impressed with his throws. What I will say is, he didn't look great in the throwing drills, but I said in my preview, and I'll say it again, these guys are throwing to receivers they've never thrown to before. They have no rhythm or timing with any of these guys. So, whilst I take some stock in how guys look on their throws, I'm not going to just write a guy off because of a subpar throwing day at the combine. If you want to see whether or not a quarterback can throw the ball, then watch the tape. His athletic testing was bad. He has the lowest vertical and broad jump of any quarterback this year. I think I can probably jump higher and further than him. But he's a quarterback, not a wide receiver. He's got a big frame and he moves well enough for his size. I don't really care how high he can jump. Look, I'm not pounding the table for Will Howard as a first-round pick, not even as a second-round pick. But, his apparent poor combine performance hasn't really changed my mind about him being a decent option at quarterback, either late day 2 or more preferably day 3. And that's not just the Buckeye bias, I promise. In regards to Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, both guys didn't participate, but they both really impressed me in their media availabilities. I love their confidence. I love their attitude. I think it will take them both far in the NFL. The growing sentiment from the combine seems to be that Cam Ward is stretching his lead as quarterback 1 in the draft, and that Shedeur Sanders isn't as viewed as high as teams as maybe the media are. I think it's safe to say Cam Ward is going to be the first quarterback taken off the board. It's a matter of if that's to the Titans taking him at 1, the Browns taking him at 2, or a team trading up to one of those spots to take him. Moving on to the running backs, I've talked all off-season about how big of a need this is for the Browns, and what a year to need a running back, because there's a lot of good running backs this year. I said in my preview that if Caleb Johnson went and lit up the combine, then the dream would be over, as he would be a first-round pick. So I'm glad that he didn't. And I hope the overreaction to his testing data results in him falling into the Browns' lap on day 2. He ran a 4.57 40 with a 1.62 10-yard split, and didn't participate in any of the jump-in drills. Not great numbers for a running back. The lack of top-end speed was his biggest criticism coming into this process, and he was unable to expel any of those doubts with the data. But I already knew he wasn't going to run a blistering 40, as that's not what his game is about. So whilst I obviously would have liked to see a faster time, it doesn't necessarily change how I view him as a prospect. What did surprise me was the slower 10-yard split, because, whilst he's not the fastest, his explosiveness is pretty evident on tape. Maybe it was just a bad day at the office, because, the tape would suggest that he is more explosive than his 10-yard split would suggest. But certainly something to consider. So we'll see how he tests at his pro day. So that's the bad or good, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, as for the physical traits, as expected, brilliant. He measured in at 6'1", 224 pounds with 33-inch arms and over 9-inch hands. He's a fucking beast of a running back. It's why I'm not as concerned about the 40 time. Nick Chubb ran a 4.52. Alvin Kamara ran a 4.56. 2 running backs with similar traits to Caleb Johnson, in my opinion. As mentioned again in my preview, he is a patient runner with fantastic vision. He doesn't need to run a 4.3. He's more explosive enough. He's explosive enough on tape, and his running style fits perfectly with what the Browns want to do with their West Coast zone run scheme. I'm still a believer. Caleb Johnson would still be, one of my top 2 picks at running back for the Browns. Talk about his 40 time all you want. He's a pick that I am willing to bet on. That other pick for me is Omarion Hampton. Now, he might not even be there in the second round because what a combine for the UNC running back. I mentioned RAS in my preview. It's a score that essentially compares prospects' relative athletic ability amongst their position. So Hampton recorded a 9.93 RAS, which is the 14th best score out of 1,909 running backs since 1987. He measured in at just a smidge under 6 foot and around 221 pounds. He's got a big frame, similar to Caleb Johnson, but his athletic testing was much better. 4.46 40 with a 1.54 10-yard split, a 38-inch vertical and a 10-foot 10-inch broad jump. As I mentioned in my preview, he's an explosive and powerful runner on tape, and the testing data just only backs that up. He's going to be a really fun running back to watch in the NFL. I think there will be genuine debate about whether he should be running back 1. Whilst Ginchy likely gets drafted ahead of him, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Hampton goes in the first round. The Ohio State boys also had themselves a fantastic weekend. And I probably, to be honest, owe Quinshon Judkins an apology because I said that, Trevion Henderson would probably steal the show in terms of the athletic testing. But boy, did Judkins make sure nobody forgot about him. Henderson tested great, don't get me wrong, as expected. He ran a 4.43 with a 1.52 10-yard split. He weighed over 200 pounds at 5'10", which is more than fine, and also jumped really well with a 38.5-inch vertical and a 10-foot 8-inch broad jump. Fantastic testing, which resulted in a 9.45 RAS. But Quinshon actually recorded a higher RAS at 9.88, which is the 23rd best out of any running back since 1987. At just under 6 foot and 221 pounds, he ran a 4.48 40 with a 1.57 10-yard split, and he also recorded a 38.5-inch vertical and a whopping 11-foot broad jump. Just incredible testing from Quinshon at his size, and definitely improved his draft stock. As I said in my preview, I'd be happy with either Trevion or Quinshon on the Browns, and they are my 3rd and 4th running back prospects for me in terms of for the Browns after Johnson and Hampton. For those wondering, I'm not including Ashton Ginchy in this because the Browns aren't drafting a running back in the first round. Let's just make that clear. As for some of the guys in a more kind of round 3 or later range, if that's where the Browns are going to target, Bashul Tutin, I probably butchered that as I do with most of these names, out of Virginia Tech, absolutely lit up the athletic testing. He ran a 4.32 40 with a 1.49 10-yard split. That's faster than Jahmyr Gibbs and Saquon Barkley. He also recorded a 40.5-inch vertical and a 10-foot 10-inch broad jump. He also weighed in at over 200 pounds, which is great for a guy at 5'9". So if the Browns were to look for a speedy back later on in the draft, this is certainly their guy. He's probably not a running back 1 in the NFL, which is of course what the Browns need, but he could definitely contribute in a role either behind another guy or by committee. DJ Giddens, RJ Harvey and Raheem Sanders are also some late day 2 to day 3 prospects that the Browns could target, who also lit up the combine testing. I've spoke about how good this running back class is all off season, and this just shows how strong it is. I mean, you've got guys that are projected to go in the 4th and 5th rounds who had great production at college, as well as literally historic combine testing data. Just an insane class, and there's plenty of options that the Browns could take. You could arguably find a starter in the 4th or 5th round at running back. And finally, on the running backs, I mentioned in the preview that Ollie Gordon could massively boost his draft stock if he ran fast, but unfortunately for him, he did not. 4.61 40 with a 1.6 10-yard split. It's pretty poor. Not a great vertical or broad jump either. He's a beast of a back, but he lacks explosiveness, and it's pretty evident both on the tape and with the data. I do think he could be a serviceable running back in a role, maybe with a guy like Booton as a kind of yin-yang type of duo, but I doubt the Browns would go down that route, and, he's not athletic enough to be a number one back, so I expect him to probably be off the Browns board. Moving on to the offensive linemen, again, not to keep going on about it, but I mentioned in my preview, that a lot of these tackles had to prove that they were tackles, and none more so than Will Campbell. He tested great. The athleticism is plus level, but he's not big enough to play tackle in the NFL, in my opinion. His arms are below the 33-inch threshold that teams look for at tackle, and his wingspan is also pretty short as well. He's a hell of a lineman, and he'll be a great guard in the NFL, I am sure of that. He's just not a tackle, in my opinion. As far as the actual tackles go, Josh Connolly and Armand Membu are guys that, I mentioned the Browns could target if they made it to pick 33. And after this weekend, I doubt that they will. Josh Connolly isn't the biggest, but he's got long enough arms and, arguably moved better than any other tackle prospect in his drills. He ran a 1.71 10-yard split and recorded a 34.5-inch vertical at over 300 pounds. He's incredibly athletic for his size. Teams will want him to put more weight on. But he's going to be an enticing prospect for any team that needs a tackle in that kind of back end of the first round. And then as for Membu, he might end up being the first offensive lineman drafted this year. Incredibly athletic. The testing was there. It was great movement in his drills to match the production and the tape from Missouri. A 4.91 40 with a 1.74 10-yard split, 34-inch vertical and 9-foot 7-inch broad jump at 332 pounds is insane. He had a 9.82 RAS, which ranks 26 out of 1,379 offensive tackles since 87, which is even more incredible when you realize that his height actually negatively affects his RAS. Both those guys are tackles in the NFL, in my opinion, and I'd even go out on a whim to say that I'd even consider drafting Membu in a trade back scenario. I'd consider it. As for more realistic day two options, I mentioned Ursary in my preview, and he tested really, really well. He's the most traditional tackle build at 6'6", 331 pounds, but he also moves really well, which was shown in the testing data. He had a RAS of 9.89, which ranked 16th all time. He certainly boosted his draft stock for sure. Speaking of tackles being guards like Will Campbell, what about guards actually being tackles? Because Ohio State might have been playing Donovan Jackson in the wrong position. For someone who was clearly fighting through an injury, he moved incredibly well and, showed the footwork and fluidity needed to play tackle in the NFL. He's a bit on the shorter side, but his arms are just about long enough and he's athletic enough that I think it could work. Him and Josh Simmons could potentially both be first rounders, or even the first two Buckeyes selected. I also mentioned in my combine preview that if the Browns were to go guard, then my first choice would be Gray Zabel, and that has not changed. Incredible testing from Gray at 6'6" and over 300 pounds. He's a beast in the interior and is probably my favourite guard prospect behind Will Campbell, who of course would be way out of the Browns' range anyway. Finally, on offense, I didn't mention tight end or wide receiver as much in the preview, but I'll touch on a couple guys. Jaden Higgins, someone that I've spoke about in previous videos, had himself a great combine. I mean, he's 6'4" and he ran a 4.47 40 with a 1.53 10-yard split. He also had a 39-inch vertical and a 10-foot 8-inch broad jump. He recorded a 9.87 RAS, which ranks 46th all-time for wide receivers since '87. And of those 3,408 wide receivers that is counting out of, he's in the 94th percentile for height, the 96th percentile for arm length, and the 94th percentile for speed score. He has the build and athleticism to be a true X-receiver in the NFL. I didn't quite understand why he was being viewed as a late day 2 pick, before the combine, and even more so now. I'd be incredibly happy if he fell into the Browns' lap in the 3rd round. I think you'd even potentially consider it in the 2nd. Moving on to another Iowa State wide receiver. I mean, what were they feeding these guys in Iowa? Jalen Noel would probably be my number 1 day 3 pick at wide receiver. He's got decent enough size at 5'10", 194 pounds, and he's explosive as hell. A 4.39 40 with a 1.51 10-yard split. He also led all receivers with a 41.5-inch vertical and a 11-foot 2-inch broad jump, which is pretty insane. The guy nearly jumped out of the stadium. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that he actually finished in the top 10 of all receivers in every single athletic drill. Crazy athleticism, decent enough college production. I'm certainly a Jalen Noel fan for sure. Finally, on offense, I think I said finally twice now, but finally on offense, actually finally. I mentioned Harold Fanning in the preview because I know that he's someone a lot of fans are intrigued by, and, I want to defend him a little bit. He ran a 4.7 40, which had social media calling him the most unathletic tight end ever. Hilarious stuff. He actually finished, the combine with an 8.43 RAS, which is above average. So above average athleticism. Whilst the 40 wasn't the fastest, the 10-yard split was great, as was his free cone. I care more about a tight end's explosiveness than I do about their top end speed, as should everyone. He actually has a fairly similar athletic profile to Isaiah Likely. 6'3", 241 pounds is pretty small for a tight end. I get it. But, Brock Bowers is literally the same size, and I'm obviously not comparing Fanning to Bowers. Bowers is generational. But the point I'm making is I don't need all my tight ends to be 6'5", 260 pounds. People are calling him limited and claiming he's nothing more than a H-back in the NFL. I do push back on it. I think he can play tight end in the NFL within the right system. He's not going to be an every down guy, but he can certainly contribute to an NFL offense. If he falls drastically because of this stuff, then I'd happily scoop him up as someone to pair with Njoku. But that's it for the offense. Moving on to the defense. I said in my preview that I expected Shamar Stewart to light up the combine, and boy did he. He recorded the 2nd best RAS score of any player at the combine this year with a 9.99 score, which ranks 3rd out of 1,802 defensive ends since 1987. You might be thinking, who the fuck did better than that? Don't worry, I will get to that. But as for Shamar, I said that he's a top 10 pick, and shit, he might even be a top 5 pick. Truly generational, athletic and physical profile at the defensive end position. A 4.640 with a 1.58 10-yard split at 6'5", 267 pounds is just insane. A 40-inch vertical, 10-foot, 11-inch broad jump at that size is even more insane. We're talking Myles Garrett type generational physical traits here. People will criticize the lack of production at college, but he consistently got pressure on tape, and the lack of sacks was more down to scheme, in my opinion. He'll be a beast in the NFL. He's arguably the 2nd best defensive lineman in the class, and I would happily take him in a trade back scenario for the Browns. And to be honest, get me drunk enough, and you might even convince me to do it at number 2 if Abdul Carter is gone. Mason Graham didn't end up competing in any of the drills and measured in slightly undersized for his position, but in the end of the day, the tape is the tape. You know, he's the best defensive tackle in the draft, in my opinion. So if that's what you want to go, that's what you do. Mike Green didn't participate in any of the testing, so I can't really comment much. You know, he talked about his sexual assault charge in the press conference. So as I said in the preview, you know, his draft stock will entirely depend on how he gets on in his interviews, because he's got a lot of baggage to account for. James Pearce ran really fast and tested well as expected. You know, it will be enough to get him talked about as a potential first rounder. But to be honest, I think the media is a lot higher on him than the draft community are. So I think it's pretty likely he'll be there day 2. Jack Sawyer, obviously the Buckeye, unfortunately had a pretty disappointing combine. He lost his foot in a couple of times on the on-field drills and didn't participate in any of the athletic testing, so he didn't do, you know, too much to improve his draft stock. Hopefully teams see enough in the tape when it comes to Jack Sawyer. Finally, I mentioned Dion Walker in the preview as someone who intrigued me as a late day 2, day 3 prospect on the interior. You know, I said if he tested well in the agility drills, he would have really boosted his stock, but he didn't do that great. You know, the numbers weren't very good. He's still incredibly raw at just 20 years old, but you know, you cannot teach his size at 6'7", 331 pounds and an 85-inch wingspan. So if he is there day 3, I probably still would be intrigued. Finally, on defense, the safeties. Now, I mentioned earlier that Shamar Stewart's 9.99 RAS was actually the second highest of the combine. That is because South Carolina's safety, Nick Emanwari, had arguably the greatest combine in NFL history. A perfect 10 RAS, which ranks first amongst all strong safeties since 1987. The even crazier part, he would have also had a perfect RAS and the best all-time at both free safety and cornerback when adjusted to those positions. He'd also be a 9.9999 at wide receiver and only second behind Calvin Johnson all-time, and even a 9.87 at linebacker when you would adjust the testing data to that position. So he's truly a unicorn and a genuine athletic freak. Any dream of him making it to the second round is over, because he might even be the first defensive back taken off the board, if we're counting Travis Hunter as a wide receiver, that is. Sorry to keep referring back to the preview, but you know, I mentioned in that how I was probably most intrigued to see how Emanwari tested more than any other prospect this weekend, and I couldn't have even predicted what he did down in Indy. Truly incredible stuff. I mean, what the fuck are they feeding these kids nowadays? I mean, my jolly, wow. Malachi Starks didn't test that great, but looked fantastic during, you know, the on-the-field drills, and you know, he has the best tape and the best production in the class, so it will be really interesting to see him and, you know, Emanwari battle it out for the number 1 safety spot. Now, I listed Xavier Watts, Andrew Makuba, and Kevin Winston as more realistic options for the Browns at safety, but unfortunately, Watts and Winston didn't test. So you'll have to wait for my safety prospect dive to hear a bit more about those guys. And as for Makuba, you know, he only participated in some drills. He weighed in slightly undersized at 186 pounds for his, you know, 5'11" frame. He did run a 4.4840 with a 1.58 10-yard split, which is more than solid. Gonna have to bet on the tape and, you know, what we see from their pro days and, you know, the prospect visits when it comes to these guys, as we didn't get too much out of the combine on them. And then finally on Travis Hunter, You know, he's so well media trained, man. It's, you know, they didn't get anything out of him. He's adamant he can play cornerback and wide receiver in the NFL, and I agree with him. He didn't test as he didn't need to. We know he's one of the best athletes in the draft, and you know, whilst it wouldn't be my preference, I'm not going to have any complaints if the Browns draft him second overall. But speaking of the Browns, all of the smoke coming out of the combine seems to be that they want Cam Ward at number 2 overall. Now, as someone who knows way too much about how this front office operates because I pay too much attention to it, this is pretty fishy to me. You know, they're very secretive in how they operate, usually. So why are they all of a sudden willing to let everyone and their dog know that they want Cam Ward at number 2? Now, I could be wrong, and maybe they do want Cam, but I think this is probably a smoke screen to try and get a team to jump up to 1 and take Cam Ward, so the Browns can just take Abdul Carter at number 2. And I'm not just saying this because obviously Carter is my number 1 player in the draft. You know, there's also been a lot of smoke about how the Giants and the Jets are the 2 teams trying to move up to 1, which would of course be for a quarterback. So who knows? But I just don't buy that the Browns would be telling everyone that they want Cam Ward at number 2 if that's what they actually wanted to do. It's going to be an interesting few weeks for sure. We got so much to talk about leading up to the draft in April. I'll be doing prospect dives into these players, you know, mock drafts, and giving my thoughts on who I think the Browns should draft, as well as who I think they will actually draft, because they are 2 different things. And we will still obviously have free agency to come on the 12th of March, so not long at all before we even get to that. So, you know, I'll be doing videos on the free agent targets and all of that good stuff as well. Busy. The NFL truly never sleeps, even in the off season. Now, you know, I'm trying to balance all these videos with a full-time job, as well as self-moving myself, as well as my parents' house over the next few weeks. But I promise I'll be doing my best to get the best content out that I can. All I ask is that you return the favour by hitting that subscribe button. But that would do it for me today, guys. I probably missed a few things, but you know, I tried to cram as much into this as I can. If you do enjoy my content, then please drop this video a like, hit the subscribe button. It's free, but it really helps out my channel. You can also check the links in the description to see where you can follow and interact with me on social media. I'm trying to build a community of Cleveland Browns fans, and as I always say, even if I only get to talk to 1 fan a day, I'm happy because I'm talking Browns football with the best fan base in the world. Thanks again for watching, guys. Have an amazing week, but most importantly, go Browns.